Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 2, Philosophy from Questions and Answers, Fundamentals of the Occult Sciences by Manly P. Hall. Philosophy Part 2, give a definition of philosophy. To appreciate the scope and value of philosophy and its superiority over every other branch of learning, it seems appropriate to consider briefly the opinions of learned men relative to the importance and dignity of this noblest of human institutions. The quotations which follow are for the most part verbatim, but in a few cases we have slightly condensed the original statements, in no way, however, adding to or altering the meaning. Hume: be a philosopher, but amidst all your philosophy be still a man. Learning should never separate a man from his world, nor cause him to feel himself superior to others. Rather, it should bring him closer to the heart of mankind and bestow upon his soul a realization of the dignity of all life and the identity of all creatures. Cicero: philosophy, rightly defined, is nothing but the love of wisdom. The soul, ultimately disappointed in human relationships, must turn from its attachment to outward forms and bestow its affection upon those imperishable truths which alone can satisfy man's yearnings. Southey: philosophy is of two kinds, that which relates to conduct and that which relates to knowledge. The first teaches us to value all things at their true worth, to be contented with little, modest in prosperity, patient in trouble, equal-minded at all times. It teaches us to our duty to our neighbor and ourselves, but it is he who pursues both that is the true philosopher. The more he knows, the more he is desirous of knowing. And yet the further he advances in knowledge, the better he understands how little he can attain, and the more deeply he feels that God alone can satisfy the infinite desires of the immortal soul. To understand this is the height and perfection of philosophy. From this definition, it becomes apparent that sacred and secular knowledge are but two aspects of one divine institution. True philosophy is not satisfied to reason only upon mortal concerns, but rises to loftier speculation, intent upon discovering not only the law, but the maker of the law. Gifford: divine philosophy, by whose pure light we first distinguish, then pursue the right. Thy power the breast from every error frees, and weeds out all its vice by degrees. It is most fitting that a definition of philosophy should come to us in verse, for as science is the prose of existence, so philosophy is the poetry of living. By the perception of divine realities, we finally poetize the dissonant themes of life. Epictetus: all philosophy lies in two words, sustain and abstain. The wise man sustains his reason by feeding upon a sufficient diet of thoughts. He abstains from that which will bring sickness to his mind by eliminating from his thinking and living all thoughts and actions which are unreasonable and destructive. In wonder all philosophy began. In wonder it ends, and admiration fills up the interspace. But the first is the wonder of ignorance, the last, the parent of adoration. Only the philosopher possesses the power of intelligent appreciation. To the wise man, the wisdom of the universe becomes apparent. From the intelligent contemplation of existence arises a full realization of the perfection of that parent cause upon which all creation hangs. Cicero: to study philosophy is nothing but to prepare oneself to die. We may face the small issues of the day with ignorance and still preserve some small illusion of security, but in the presence of that great transition which is the inevitable fate of all men, our only security lies in some adequate appreciation of the universe and its plan. Qualls: make philosophy thy journey. How wise was that old emblem writer when he perceived that life is a journey in wisdom, action and experience in knowledge, and truth is the whole purpose of our being. Epictetus: the first business of philosophy is to part from self-conceit. A man who overestimates himself will underestimate his world. To be humble is to admit the greatness of the universe. Out of a becoming humility arises the capacity for understanding. Max Muller: philosophy is the knowledge of the limits of our knowledge. Beyond the small circle of the known stretches an eternity of uncertainties. Of this the wise man is aware, but he has found security in the realization that beyond the eternities of the unknown again is the all-sufficient circumference of truth. Aristotle: philosophy is the science which considers truth. Though Pilate's question remains unanswered, It is the opinion of the wise man that it is not unanswerable. The philosopher knows that there is but one way to discover truth, and that is to become truth. Philosophy is the science of becoming. Bulwer Lytton. Real philosophy seeks rather to solve than to deny. When the temple of wisdom is completed, much of its foundation will be made up of stones which sophists have rejected. There is no virtue in denying things as they are, but there is great virtue in discovering the reason for things as they are. Seneca. It is the bounty of nature that we live, but of philosophy that we live well, which is in truth a greater benefit than life itself. To live without thinking is to descend to the state of the brute, but to crown life with intelligent action is to rise to the estate of the Superman. Lavater. True philosophy is that which makes us to ourselves and to all about us better. There is no merit in wisdom, there is no reward in knowledge, there is no comfort in faith, unless these things manifest outwardly, subduing the violence of action and bringing us to a harmless mode of existence. Nesbit. The modern skeptical philosophy consists in believing everything but the truth, and exactly in proportion to the want of evidence, in making windows that shut out the light and passages that lead to nothing. Philosophy is nothing if not noble. It is of no value unless it inclines the race to gentle virtue and noble action. To the measure that it fails to adore the one, serve the beautiful, and venerate the good, it fails to be philosophy. Voltaire. The discovery of what is true and the practice of that which is good are the two most important objects of philosophy. Thinking is not merely an exercising of the mind, it is a directing of the mind. Only such as have organized thought to the accomplishment of some actual good are worthy to be denominated wise. Shaftesbury. The sum of philosophy is to learn what is just in society and beautiful in nature and the order of the world. Philosophy is founded upon vision and experience, vision to perceive a noble end, and experience to modulate man's natural impulse to over-hasten the reformation of his world. Plutarch. Philosophy is the art of living. The arts are sciences of the beautiful, and if philosophy be the art of living, it must be the art of living beautifully. Shaftesbury. It is not a head merely, but a heart and resolution which complete the real philosopher. Reason arises not from intellect alone, but from the whole life. It is built upon wise thinking, generous feeling, and trained perceptions. Thoreau. To be a philosopher is not merely to have subtle thoughts, but to so love wisdom as to live according to its dictates. Philosophy is first living, then thinking. The philosophic life is the only foundation upon which a code of intelligent action can be built. Seneca. Philosophy is the art and law of life. By this, Seneca infers that philosophy is a rule of procedure, a code by the living of which man becomes worthy of happiness. John Selden. Philosophy is nothing but discretion. By discretion we should understand that regulation of action by which all intemperances are controlled, whether they be of the mind or of the body. He who is discreet is above an unreasonable act and may be justly termed wise. Cowley. To be a husbandman is but a retreat from the city, to be a philosopher from the world, or rather a retreat from the world as it is man's into the world as it is God's. The world of God and the world of man are not separated by any distance other than the interval of understanding. As we grow wise, we depart not into some distant country, but rather we perceive the wise man's world emerging from the very ignorant world of our own sphere. Burke. Philosophy is queen of the arts and the daughter of heaven. The wisest of the sages have always maintained that wisdom had its beginning not among men, but among the gods from whom it descended for the salvation of humanity. Seneca. Philosophy is the health of the mind. It is normal for man that he should think well, but the blight of materialism has destroyed his birthright to wisdom. It is therefore necessary in this benighted age for each man to struggle valiantly if he is to achieve to a normal and reasonable state. Londos. A true philosopher is beyond the reach of fortune. To be truly wise, it is necessary to so love wisdom that there is no place left in the mind for anxieties concerning the temporal state. He who lives in desire for plenty or in fear of loss has no right to call himself a philosopher. Sims. Philosophy is reason with the eyes of the soul. The intellect in itself can perceive nothing beyond that which is intellectual, but the intellect, when quickened with spiritual perception, bestows the philosophic viewpoint. hair. The business of philosophy is to circumnavigate human nature. A philosopher must be fortified against himself. Philosophy is a conspiracy against the inadequacy of ourselves. By it, we are given courage to act more nobly than is natural to the human animal. Lamartine. Philosophy is the rational expression of genius. We may define genius as special aptitude, but when special aptitude is directed to the most important of all efforts, the perfection of self, it is termed philosophy. A philosopher is a genius who has discovered the most perfect use of his abilities. Joubert. Whence, whither, why, how? These questions cover all philosophy. Whence first cause? Whither to first cause? Why law? How wisdom? From the infinite to the infinite we must proceed. The why of life is known only to the maker. But from philosophy we learn how to fit ourselves into the plan of life and to prepare ourselves for final identity with our cause. Carlyle. The philosopher is he to whom the highest has descended and the lowest has mounted up, who is the equal and kindly brother to all. Between heaven and earth stands the wise man. His earthy part has been raised to its highest perfection as the instrument of a divine purpose. The higher part, the soul itself, has become tolerant of the limitations of the body, and wise in its own weakness is tolerant of the limitations of all other things. In conclusion, let us define philosophy: the perfect science and the science of perfection. What are the greatest systems of philosophy? Schools of philosophy are generally considered under two headings, Eastern and Western. The principal difference between the two schools lies in the concept of first cause or God. Oriental philosophers regard deity as a state or condition of realization, while Western philosophers regard it as a conscious or intellectual principle. The ends to be achieved by the two schools are likewise irreconcilable. Western philosophy postulates the ultimate perfection of mankind in the production of a superior or divine type. Eastern philosophy postulates the ultimate absorption of man into the modes of consciousness constituting the reality which supports the universe. The principal schools of Western philosophy are the Platonic and Aristotelian, named for their founders. Plato excels in the profundity and scope of his thought, and Aristotle in the thoroughness of his examinations and in the faculty of classification. The Christian philosophers of the ante-Nicene and post-Nicene schools drew the substance of their doctrines from Plato and Aristotle, and therefore cannot be regarded as the founders of independent systems. Probably the most important modern philosophers in the West were Francis Bacon and Immanuel Kant. The Eastern schools include Brahmanism, Buddhism, Vedantic and Yogi philosophy in India, and Confucianism and Taoism in China. Unquestionably, Buddhism is Asia's great philosophy, and no school of Indian thought has escaped its influence. Buddhism, spreading into China, contributed its part also to the development of Taoism and Confucianism. There have been many great philosophers both in the East and West, but if from among them all we must choose the greatest, Buddha and Plato stand preeminent. The intellects of these men are unsurpassed and unequaled in the records of human thinking. Both were mystics and occultists in the highest sense of these words. Both gave to the world great civilizing systems of culture, and for over 20 centuries have been the constant inspiration of the noblest thinkers of the human race. What are the 7 branches of philosophy? According to the opinions of the classical philosophers, the general term philosophy embraced 7 distinct departments of thought as follows. Metaphysics, the consideration of the superphysical causes which support the world. According to philosophy, all visible things are suspended from invisible causes, the universe itself being merely the visible manifestation of invisible principles. Metaphysics is that department of thought devoted to the discovery and classification of those divine or spiritual energies that are indeed the ever-invisible roots of the tree of life. Logic is the discipline of reasonableness. Untrained minds are incapable of determining the truthfulness or fact value in conflicting systems of thought. To be logical, a fact must arise from a certain source and flow formally to reasonable and consistent conclusions. Logic teaches man to think things through and not to accept confused and inconsistent premises merely because he lacks the faculty to compare one opinion with another and determine that which is the most reasonable. The primary rule is the law of cause and effect. Ethics may be defined as that branch of philosophy which applies the great truths of life to the social relationships of the individual. Ethics is the living of the laws of the philosophic life. No one can be unethical and at the same time wise, for ethics is the certain evidence of inward enlightenment. Ethics lies at the root of civilization, and civilization implies a commonwealth of purpose united upon ethical principles of procedure. Ethics is both behavior and relationship. Psychology meant to the ancients the science of the soul. It was that part of philosophy which was devoted to the understanding of the subjective part of human consciousness. Psychology involves not only an examination of the 8 parts of the soul, but also the perfecting of exercises and disciplines by which the soul can be perfected and released from the domination of the animal instincts of the lower nature. Epistemology is concerned with the subject of knowledge itself. Is it possible for an imperfect creation to possess the capacity to even grasp the import of perfection? Is truth actually knowable to an imperfect man? The general conclusion in this department has been that man cannot know absolute truth, but is capable of realizing an ever-unfolding standard of relative truth. The finite cannot know the infinite, but all men perceive better than they do, and by living up to what they perceive, they grow towards the infinite which lies beyond. Aesthetics is the philosophy and science of beauty. The philosophy of beauty leads to the inevitable conclusion that the beautiful is an aspect of the divine nature. Beauty is to the soul what food is to the body. The inward man rejoices in the appearance of symmetry, harmony, and rhythm. Aesthetics as a science cultivates man's love of beauty through the arts, painting, poetry, music, and the dance. These have always been part of religion. One of the duties of religion is to nourish the soul through the cultivation of the aesthetic arts. Theurgy is the 7th and last part of philosophy. It has been called divine magic. Under the term are included the most secret metaphysical practices and the deepest philosophical disciplines. Theurgy is the understanding of certain divine procedures whereby the human reason can be lifted up into unity with and participation in the effulgence of universal consciousness. It is the end of philosophy that man should know good and be one with God. What are the philosophical disciplines referred to by Pythagoras? Pythagoras established a philosophical community at Crotona, a Dorian province in Italy, nearly 500 years before the Christian era. Those entering the community bestowed all their worldly goods upon the school and lived together in spiritual brotherhood. If for any reason a member chose to depart from the community, his possessions were returned to him and a headstone was erected in the community cemetery. This was to signify that the departure from the community was equivalent to philosophic death. Pythagoras taught his disciples that philosophy was not only an occupation for the mind, but a discipline for the body and soul. He imposed certain regulations as indispensable to the development of understanding. These were called the Pythagorean disciplines. The first of these disciplines was the imposing of a period of silence upon the candidates. No one could be accepted into the inner circle of the Pythagorean school without a probationship of 5 years. These 5 years had to be spent in silence, no word to be spoken during that time. After this ordeal had been successfully passed, and over 100 disciples succeeded in this difficult requirement, the candidate was then able to control his tongue and to think before speaking. Pythagoras taught that there could be no great improvement of the mind apart from a general improvement of the whole life. If men were to think better, they should live better. For no man's thoughts could be higher than the standard of his action. If a man would think great and noble thoughts, he must purify and refine his body and soul. In teaching philosophy, Pythagoras therefore emphasized that education is not only a way of thinking, but a way of living. The Pythagoreans practiced retrospection in the evening of each day. This was a discipline of remembrance and the analysis of past action. The disciple examined his every thought and impulse during the day just past, estimating its significance and deeply regretting any unkind or destructive impulse that had marred the serenity of his living. From this discipline arose forethought. Thought should precede action and not follow it. It is unphilosophical for a man to act first and think afterwards. No word or deed should spring from thoughtlessness. By retrospection, the disciple becomes responsible, recognizing the importance of his words and deeds. The Pythagoreans also practiced concentration. They trained the mind to examine into the causes and results of action, and particularly they cultivated continuity of thought. In addition to these mental disciplines, the Pythagoreans practiced charity and temperance, avoiding the consciousness of possession and the excesses of the appetites. They encouraged a gentleness and simplicity of manner and dedicated their lives to a code of harmoniousness and detachment. The members of the order were frequently invited to participate in the problems of politics and in the courts of law. Their judgment was always impartial and their advice democratic and just. They believed completely that only those who live the life can know the doctrine. What is the difference between religion and philosophy? Religion is satisfied to worship. Philosophy seeks to understand. Religions are paths of the heart, philosophy is paths of the mind. Emotion is a dominant factor in religion but plays a small part in philosophy. Religious hysteria is an excess of emotion which finds no place in a philosopher's code. It seldom occurs to the religious person that salvation must be earned. To him, belief and acceptance are the foundations of security. Prayer and penance are mighty forces to the religiously minded, but the zealot seldom inquires into the nature of the God to whom he prays and seldom attempts to analyze the efficacy of the penances. By the philosopher, intelligent living is regarded as more efficacious than platitudes and affirmations, and knowledge more virtuous than blind acceptance. In ancient times, religion and philosophy constituted one body of learning. All priests were philosophers and all philosophers were priests. After the decline of classical civilization, the body of knowledge was divided. Religion and philosophy became separate institutions. Religion was left mindless and philosophy heartless. The result was the sad dilemma that we find today. Blind theologies on the one hand, and materialistic, soulless philosophies on the other. But the student must differentiate between the morbid, conflicting philosophies of today and the great ideals for which original philosophy stood. For that reason, there is little use in studying modern philosophies, nor can modern translations of old philosophies always be trusted. To the metaphysician, philosophy means that sublime department of ancient learning, which has been justly called the science of sciences. The purpose of philosophy is to discover truth, to understand truth, to lift the intellect into final union with the ageless wisdom that sustains the world. This was also the original task of religion. In modern theologies, however, the purposes of religion are obscured, and hundreds of petty sects are casting lots for the garments of authority. Religion is purification, philosophy is wisdom. Religion is aspiration, philosophy is realization. In religion, man comes to love truth, and through philosophy to attain truth. The beginning of the path is the realization of the reality of things unseen, and the consummation of life is to be one with that sovereign and perfect knowledge which religion has called the light of ages. What solution does philosophy offer to the problems of life? As a moderator of all extremes, philosophy brings life under the rule of reason. It is not the purpose of philosophy to merely intellectualize living, but rather, through improving the mind, to give each person a perspective sufficient to inspire towards constructive and well-purposed action. Most of the evils of modern living are rooted in thoughtlessness, rather than actual ignorance. Most people know much better than they do, but they lack continuity of mental purpose. The mind is the governor of the body. If the mind fails in judgment, the body suffers, and the whole life loses meaning and purpose. One should not think of philosophy as an abstract science of the ancients, but as an ever-practical guide to the daily decisions of life. Each individual must have some standard within himself to inspire towards the realization of the one, the doing of the beautiful, and the achievement of the good. Philosophy, as religion, would bring to an end the conflict of cults and creeds, uniting all men in the worship of one supreme principle. Philosophy, as science, would consider not only the diversified phenomena of nature, but would realize that all manifesting things are fragments of one eternal being and manifestations of one absolute and sufficient law. Philosophy, as politics, would bring nations into a rational comradeship of purpose, recognizing individuality but circumscribing all separate purposes with one universal and sufficient program. To whatever branch of living and thinking we apply philosophy, there comes deeper realization, greater courage of accomplishment, and a better understanding of that which is necessary and that which can be accomplished. Only the philosopher has the wisdom to understand, the courage to do, and the discretion to accomplish all things in the noblest and most impersonal way. Why does this age have so few philosophers? While it may not be said that man is entirely a product of his age, it is nevertheless true that environment and opportunity have much to do in molding the outward character of individuals. Man, having within himself numerous talents and abilities, usually manifests those most consistent with his environment. In an age of poets, all men will naturally try to write poetry, and what men try to do, they draw out from themselves. In philosophical eras, thinking is a fashion, but in economic eras, thinking is unfashionable and accumulation is the fancy of the day. Plato explains that philosophical eras are the result of great cycles of time. These cycles he terms a great year, explaining that as the ordinary year is made up of spring, summer, autumn, and winter, each with a certain degree of fertility or sterility, so in a great year, made up of 25,000 human years, there are similar seasons. In sterile seasons, men turn to material and inferior accomplishments, whereas in fertile seasons, philosophers flourish. The most fertile season of each great cycle is called the Golden Age, and all men live together in enlightenment. Then there are the ages of silver, bronze, and iron, wherein spiritual matters diminish. The mind of man, suffering from the sterility of its world, diminishes in stature until, in the age of iron, wars and hatreds destroy the ignorant and the perverse. But even in sterile seasons, there is an occasional exception to the general rule, even as some crops grow in off years. There are some wise with us always. But in sterile seasons, wisdom is the exception, whereas in fertile periods, it is the rule. It is harder to be virtuous and intelligent when this effort is opposed by the whole general trend of society, but in no time is accomplishment actually impossible. Like the ebbing and flowing of the sea are the alternations of spiritual and material eras. Like day and night, one follows the other. This is an era of darkness, but there is a light that shines in the darkness for those who can discover it. The path of wisdom is obscured by the night of ignorance, but the sincere carry a light of their own and discover the path in spite of the encircling gloom. Is it possible to separate spirituality and wisdom? In other words, can a person be spiritually perfect and yet not possess all knowledge? It is not possible to separate spirituality and wisdom. Spirituality actually means that the individual lives or exists upon the level of his spiritual nature or is possessed by the divinity within him. Divinity can have no ignorance within it. God cannot lack anything. Therefore, wisdom is an inevitable correlative of complete spiritual development. The difficulty which has arisen and causes this question lies in the misunderstanding of the nature of spirituality. We are assured in the scriptures that there is not one perfect. We know that, at this stage of evolution, it is impossible for a human being to be absolutely perfect, either spiritually or physically, for perfection itself is an ultimate, far from our finite state. A person may possess a certain measure of spirituality, but even in the wisest, this measure is hopelessly incomplete. To the degree that we have spiritual development, to the same degree we must have an extension of knowledge. There are certain metaphysical groups which promise cosmic consciousness as the result of metaphysical exercises. We have met many people claiming to possess this cosmic consciousness, but a brief conversation with them clearly indicates that they are suffering only from mild hallucination. Cosmic consciousness is all-knowing, and no secret of nature can be concealed from those who possess even a moderate degree of true illumination. Any person claiming to possess cosmic consciousness and at the same time manifesting all the limitations and imperfections of the flesh must be suspected of imposture or delusion. Give the Philosopher's Creed. In his little work titled Miscellanies, Mr. Thomas Taylor, the distinguished Platonist, published what he called the Creed of the Platonic Philosopher. This creed is a summary of the whole Orphic theology as perpetuated by Pythagoras, Plato, and the Alexandrian Neoplatonists. Speaking of the Platonic philosophy, Mr. Taylor prophesies that it will again flourish for very extended periods through all the infinite revolutions of time. The following articles are a summary of the Philosopher's Creed as extracted from the legitimate disciples of the Greek mysteries. 1. I believe in one first cause of all things whose nature is so immensely transcendent that it cannot be named, spoken of, conceived by opinion, known, or perceived by any being. 2. I believe that if it be lawful to give a name to that which is ineffable, the appellations of the one and the good are the most adapted to it. The first indicates that it is the principle of all things, and the second that it is the ultimate object of the desire of all things. 3. I believe that this immense principle produced such things as are first and proximate to itself and most similar to itself. Hence, this principle produces many principles out of its own ineffable nature. 4. I believe that since all things differ from each other and are multiplied with their proper differences, each of these multitudes is suspended from one proper principle. Thus, all beautiful things, whether in soul or in body, are suspended from one fountain of beauty, etc. 5. I believe that such things as are first produced by the one good are of divine nature, most like itself, whereas those more remotely produced participate in the one good to a lesser degree, causing the differences in nature. 6. I believe that all things are transcendently more excellent in the divine nature than in their aspect of separation from the divine nature. 7. I believe that the most proper method of venerating this great principle of principles is to extend in silence the highest parts of the soul towards it in aspiration and understanding. 8. I believe that self-subsistent natures are the immediate offspring of this one principle and may be denominated the intelligible gods. 9. I believe that incorporeal form or ideas resident in a divine intellect are the archetypes or models of everything which has subsistence according to nature. 10. I believe that this world, depending on its divine artificer, is animated by divine soul and is justly called by Plato the blessed God. 11. I believe that the great body of the world may be properly called a whole on account of the perpetuity of its duration, though it is nothing more than a flowing eternity. 12. I believe that all the parts of the universe are unable to participate in the providence of divinity in a similar manner, but that all natures, according to their own essential being, participate in the first good. 13. I believe that the world, considered as one great comprehending whole, is a divine animal, possessing in the first place a self-perfect unity by which it becomes a god. In the second place, a divine intellect. In the third place, a divine soul. And in the last place, a deified body. 14. I believe that after the immense principle of principles, a beautiful series of principles proceeds, all largely partaking of the ineffable, all stamped with the occult characters of deity, all possessing an overflowing fullness of good, that from these dazzling summits, these ineffable blossoms, these divine propagations, being life, intellect, soul, nature and body depend, monads suspended from unities, deified natures proceeding from deities. 15. I believe that man is a microcosm, comprehending in himself partially everything which the world contains divinely and totally. 16. I believe that the rational part of man, of which his essence consists, is of a self-motive nature, suspended between intellect and nature. 17. I believe that the human, as well as every mundane soul, uses periods and restitutions of its proper life. Everything which is moved perpetually and participates of time revolves periodically and proceeds from the same to the same. 18. I believe that the soul, while an inhabitant of earth, is in a fallen condition, an apostate from deity, an exile from the orb of light, and that she can only be restored while on earth to the divine likeness and be able after death to reascend to the intelligible world by the exercise of the cathartic and theoretic virtues. The former purifies her from the defilements of the mortal nature, and the latter elevates to the vision of true being. Such a soul returns after death to her kindred star from which she fell and enjoys a blessed life. 19. I believe that the human soul essentially contains all knowledge, and that whatever knowledge she acquires in the present life is nothing more than a recovery of what she once possessed, and which discipline evokes from its dormant retreat. 20. I believe that the soul is punished in a future life from the crimes she has committed in the present life, but this punishment is proportioned to the crime and is not perpetual, but is in order that the soul may be restored to her proper perfection. 21. I believe that the human soul on its departure from the present life will, if not properly purified, pass into other bodies until it has perfected itself. 22. I believe lastly that souls that live according to virtue shall in other respects be happy, and when separated from the irrational nature and purified from all body, shall be conjoined with the gods and govern the whole world, together with the deity by whom it was produced. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment, and if you can please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.